I'm learning my fourth language. I've had 11 years of English in school. That's not what taught me English. What taught me English was learning the base and then starting to read and watch content. Classes never really fit because we were just doing general stuff out of a textbook. There were tasks that weren't all that engaging, and I think that's the problem with group classes, and it's probably why school is failing. A teacher, right from the get-go, is probably going to say you're going to have to learn how to make a few basic sentences if you get a tutor online, and you're going to have to memorize those, and you're going to have to memorize at least some vocabulary. And that's correct. But you can do that just as well on your own, provided that you have the right word list and some way to get a correct sentence, so you know how those sentences work. Any AI can help you with that. Or you could use my app, which gives you that. Or if you really want to do it, this is actually one of the few places where I would suggest Anki at this point, because at least it shows you how the correct sentence structure works if you built the cards correctly. Any of those methods would work probably just as well, and they would be free compared to a tutor, which would absolutely not be free. The actual bottleneck is repetition, and that repetition needs to happen over time, not in one session, because sitting down and going through 1,000 words isn't going to lead to you having those 1,000 words. Or in this case, the 250, which is what I would suggest. You need that spaced repetition to actually get them memorized. And that's not something a tutor can replace. A tutor is great because they help you correct things you're wrong about, but what you need at this point is spaced repetition, and a tutor comes into play later. Here's what people buying a tutor think they're buying, which is expertise of someone who has gone through this. And in a lot of cases, most teachers haven't done that. At least in Norway, most English teachers, they aren't actually sure about what they did to get to the level where they are at. They're good because they see English, they get English input all the time, yet they're teaching something that isn't necessarily going to get them there. So you're probably getting that with another tutor as well. What you're actually getting when you get a tutor is structure, where you have to sit down with it. And that's something you can get through accountability for some sort of group. I have my own school community for exactly that, which I would really like to grow. So jump into that if you want accountability for free. I had a few classes with a tutor, but I've never got much more than conversation experience. And that conversation experience was useful, but that's something that's actively being replaced by AI. Although it's not available in every language yet, if what you want is to understand and reply, and you don't care too much about pronunciation, AI can do most of that. What AI can't do is help you with pronunciation. And the limitation is that AI, at least in my case with Claude, can't really help. Especially not if you have a shitty microphone, or if you're trying to speak languages such as Norwegian, and you're going to have it listen to you. Because Norwegian isn't the language that Claude has implemented yet. You'll find that that's the case with quite a few languages, because most AI is made with English in mind. The most difficult thing I've noticed is that unless you have a predefined topic, having a conversation with a tutor is just way too vague. And most of the time, you don't really have enough vocabulary. There's a real benefit to having someone you can speak to on a dedicated topic rather than going through lessons, because you're probably not studying the vocabulary needed to understand tuition in that language, which means either the lesson has to happen in English or whatever language you're comfortable with, or it's going to be way less helpful because you simply don't have the vocabulary. This is one of the reasons French lessons tend to not teach you much French in school. That's at least my experience, and the experience of most Norwegians taking French. The teacher would spend most of the lesson speaking Norwegian, making sure you understood everything, and that's going to be the case with a tutor as well, unless you have a specific topic you can talk around, and therefore have the entire session in your target language. Now, this is the case for my wife too. A lot of the time during our Norwegian lessons, I have to switch to Portuguese to explain things to her, because she wouldn't understand if the explanation came in Norwegian. If she could understand the explanation, I could have kept going in Norwegian and she'd benefit that much more because she would get that much more input during the lesson. But most people, when they study, they don't study the vocabulary needed to understand instructions. They just study general vocabulary. What I actually benefited the most from was reading a bunch of literature, and I'd gotten so much better just from that. I'd improved my vocabulary reading about 650 chapters of manga, which was fun, and I read 5 real books in Portuguese, which was the entire Percy Jackson series. That was also fun. Those things gave me the vocabulary to have the general conversation. And that's why when I started having a tutor lesson, what we could do was just have those general conversations. But at that point, you're not really paying for what you think you're paying for if you want to have conversations about anything. And either you sit down and memorize for ages, or you could do what I consider to be step 2, which is getting comprehensible input, watching series, or reading books, and that's going to be a lot more helpful than sitting down with a tutor who has to explain things mostly in another language. For me, it probably took me a year and a couple of months before I felt ready to have an actual session with a tutor where we could stick mostly to Portuguese. It could have happened sooner, but I stuck to the lingo for too long, and that made me lose the motivation, and there was no clear path that I'd learned from school. I had some experience with French where I still couldn't follow books, and I didn't understand why I was so much better at English than French, despite having French for 5 years. And I'd only had English for 4 years when I started being able to read and watch series. I wouldn't say the tutor is for step 3. I would say that that's step 4, where you go for fluency, and in some cases try to go even beyond that. Because most people are probably going to get fluency without ever scheduling a tutor call. And that's because 99% of what they need, they can get from content. It's that 1% where they don't know they're messing up, and a lot of people won't be able to explain why you're messing up or why it's wrong. That's the place where a tutor actually makes sense. If you just want to know where you're at and what the next step is, you don't need a tutor for that. You need a coach or a community of people that are actively going through it. That's going to be a lot more helpful than a tutor session. Now, step 3, after you've done enough of getting comprehensible input, is that you start talking. And that's where a conversation partner does the job. Step 4, after that, is where you go for fluency, where you speed up and get a lot more input and repetition. That's what you need for fluency. But if you really need to get past step 4 and have perfect grammar like a native, that's where a tutor is necessary. And you have to get a tutor who's actually certified, who knows grammar rules and such, and that comes way later, because grammar isn't something you should focus on early. That's the one place they can help you understand rules that take you from advanced to closer to native level. And that's probably the only point where I actually see benefit to having a tutor. If you really need conversation partners, a tutor is fine, but in most cases, you shouldn't need a tutor. If I wanted to get better at Polish, I have some friends I play Ultimate with who speak Polish all the time, so if I really wanted to learn Polish, I'd need a base vocabulary, and then I could try to interact with them in Polish. And that would probably be enough. If you don't have anyone you can interact with, then yeah, you might need a tutor. Or a community where you could schedule a call with someone else going through the exact same thing. Some people do need that accountability, and the point where most people need it is right at the beginning. That's because they're doing too much, and the method they're using isn't engaging enough. I'm trying to figure out a way to make that work better with my app. Sitting there memorizing vocabulary isn't always going to be the most engaging, but all the other parts you can make really engaging. You can make them fun, and if you make them fun, something you actually want to come back to, you're not going to need a tutor. If you really need someone to keep your accountability, and you feel like there's no better use of $50 or $60 an hour, then sure, go ahead with the tutor. But at least in my situation, that would not be worth it. If you bring the stuff you need with you everywhere you go, that makes it easier to start. If you keep the session always short by default, that also makes it easier. The easier you make it, the more likely you are to go through it, even without a tutor. And the harder it is, it's going to be the opposite. You don't want to start something you already know from the get-go. It's going to be hard. Scheduling a tutor call generally feels like you're taking the first step. And once you've taken that step, you don't really have any other choice but to show up. But you could go without that cost by just making it as easy as possible to start. If you have someone else learning a language, say, every day at this time, we send each other a snap or a message saying, I did my lesson, that's going to be enough. My wife is probably the best example of someone thinking they need a tutor and then not getting the benefits they should be getting from an actual tutor. The way she's probably going to benefit most from having me nearby is that I can stay calm and stick to Norwegian, unless it becomes really obvious that I should use Portuguese to explain. That's what she actually needs. And what she actually needs is just more interactions in Norwegian, rather than specific instructions. Consider where you are and whether that tutor call is actually going to be helpful. If you can't cancel it, but you realize it's not going to be helpful, try to get it to work more as a coaching call, where you get to know the next few steps and get an assessment, rather than getting them to teach you and believing that's the path going forward. And don't cancel it without knowing where you are. If you have no idea what stage you're at, that's also a valuable reason to go through with the call. But know that should be your intention going in, figuring out where you are. If you cancel it, that should be because you know where you are, and you also know you're not ready. If where you're at is that you need that first study list, I have a free 200-word list PDF in the description. You can get that then set up 50 more words based on your own interests, and that should be what you need to start reading or watching series and then learning from that.